There comes a moment in a woman's life when she looks into the mirror and no longer recognizes herself. She was once a gentle mother, a devoted wife, but now, in her eyes, there is an unnamed emptiness. At 40, what has made the woman who was once stable, loving, and self-sacrificing suddenly feel estranged from her own life? Society calls it a midlife crisis. But Alan Watts might say, it is not madness, but the soul's cry for awakening. When every role, every title, and every trace of beauty that once defined her value begins to dissolve, the woman is forced to face the deepest question of all. Who am I, when I am no one at all? This video is not to judge, but to understand. Because behind every crisis, there is always a soul desperately trying to find its way back home. And perhaps that is the true beginning of freedom. One day, she is still the gentle wife, the devoted mother. The next, she becomes a stranger. Not because she wants to, but because something inside her has quietly broken, like a fracture in the soul no one notices. The husband is stunned to see the woman he once knew change. She becomes distant, irritable, and cold. But behind that layer of emotion is a silent storm, an existential crisis even she cannot comprehend. At 40, a woman does not just cross a biological milestone, but a boundary between who I once was and who I will become now. She has lived her life to love, to care, to sacrifice for others, for her husband, her children, for the roles that society has set for her. But one day, when everything seems settled, she suddenly realizes that she has lost something precious, herself. Alan Watts once said that modern people live like actors who have forgotten they are playing a role. Women at 40 are the clearest proof of that. She has played the roles of wife and mother for so long that she confuses the performance with her essence. And when the curtain of life falls, she suddenly realizes, if I am no longer them, who am I? That very question marks the beginning of the crisis. The most frightening thing is not change, but awakening after years of inertia. She begins to look back, at forgotten dreams, at passions never lived. She realizes she has traded her youth to preserve something called stability. But now that everything is stable, her soul feels more uncertain than ever. It is not madness, but a form of awakening. Like someone being pulled from deep sleep by the ringing of reality, at first painful, chaotic, but also the beginning of awareness. Alan Watts once said, "When you begin to ask yourself who you are, that is when you start to wake up." But the midlife crisis of a woman, after all, is not a tragedy, but a turning point of the soul. Because only when she dares to face that emptiness does she have the chance to rediscover her true self, a me no longer defined by roles, beauty, or the approval of others. And perhaps the moment she becomes a stranger is the moment she is closer than ever to her true self. But a woman's crisis is not only the story of the soul, it is also the voice of the body. After years of living for others, when she begins to ask, "Who am I?" her body softly responds, "It's time to change." And in the previous part, we saw her standing at the threshold of awakening, a deep confusion about her identity. And now, we enter the second part of that journey, where psychology and biology blend into a storm within her. There is a time bomb in a woman's psyche, and it will explode between the ages of 35 and 45. That statement is not an exaggeration, but a truth of nature. Alan Watts once said, "You are a process, not a thing." At 40, that process within a woman's body begins to change direction. Hormones, invisible streams of energy that govern emotions, desire, and the sense of happiness, begin to recede. the brain no longer reacts as it once did to the things that used to bring joy, love, or meaning. This change is silent but fierce. One day, she realizes she no longer feels excited by what once made her heart race. A glance, a compliment, a hug, all seem dimmed. The outer world no longer reflects her value as before. And cuando she begins to hunger for affirmation. Not because she is shallow or weak, but because for 2 decades, society has taught her that a woman's worth lies in being desired. As her body changes, her brain seeks replacement doses of dopamine, attention, admiration, or simply the feeling of being seen. But as Alan Watts once said, the more you try to hold on, the more you lose. And the more she craves recognition, the further she drifts from herself, like a thirsty soul drinking seawater. Science calls it a hormonal imbalance. Philosophy calls it the daime, the dissolution of illusion. In truth, it is the moment when the body forces the soul to stop and face a simple reality. Every value built upon the validation of others is fleeting. And it is at that threshold, between the biological death of youth and the rebirth of consciousness, that a woman must choose to keep running away or to begin looking deeply within herself. Alan Watts once said, "You are not a wave trying to rise above the ocean. You are the ocean, in motion." And perhaps the midlife crisis is rarely the moment that ocean begins to awaken. If the previous part was when the body began to speak on behalf of the soul, this is when the mirror of the ego begins to crack. As hormones shift, emotions cool, and the world reflects back a different image, one no longer as radiant as before, the woman suddenly realizes, I have disappeared from my own life. When beauty fades, self-worth dissolves. That statement is not just the tragedy of beauty, but the tragedy of mistaking who I am for how I look. Throughout her youth, she was taught that love, admiration, and the gaze of others were the measures of her value. Like a professional athlete, her entire identity was built around a single ability, the ability to be desired. But as that biological stage begins to close, she loses her audience, the applause, and with them, herself. Alan Watts once said, "We suffer because we confuse ourselves with our image of ourselves." And the woman at 40 lives within that very confusion. She is not truly afraid of aging. She is afraid of becoming unseen. She fears turning invisible among those younger, fresher, more vibrant than her. And so she begins to search for the old light, compliments, glances, meaningless messages, as a way to confirm that she still exists. The words of praise that meant nothing at 20 now become precious doses of dopamine at 40. Every notification, every small admiration becomes fragile proof that she is still chosen. But the truth is, this is merely the fleeting addiction of a desperate mind. The more she craves recognition, the more she loses her inner freedom. Alan Watts once compared human beings to those endlessly chasing the shadows of themselves, and here lies the clearest example. The woman in crisis does not realize that what she truly needs is not to be seen by others, but to see herself. The tragedy is that, in trying to feel alive again, she may risk everything she once built, her family, her marriage, all that once gave her life meaning. Yet deep down, it is not destruction she seeks. She is simply trying to touch the forgotten soul within her. This hunger to be desired is not a sin, but the cry of a dying ego. And if she has the courage to listen instead of run, she will realize that what she has been seeking all along was never out there. It was always within her. The hunger to be desired does not stop at the longing to be seen. It soon turns into a battle between the self and time. After losing her identity, the woman enters what Alan Watts called the conflict between the ego and nature, where the soul resists the very laws of life. She refuses to accept fading, refuses to accept her body's change, and above all, refuses to accept that time is taking away what once defined her worth. And Wabjita, instead of surrendering, she begins to rebel against time. This rebellion does not take the form of guns or fire, but of surgical knives, extreme diets, and endless beauty treatments. She tries to preserve the old image, the face, the skin, the figure, as if holding on to them would mean holding on to herself. But Alan Watts once said, "The more you try to grasp water, the less you can hold it." Each time she resists nature, she drifts further from her true essence. The modern world fuels this rebellion. Social media becomes a virtual stage where people perform their new life, their new freedom, their better self. There, women see thousands of others starting over, divorcing, traveling, transforming, loving again, and they believe that freedom lies in abandoning the old. But that is only illusion. Alan Watts once warned, "We think we are free when we run from what we fear, but that is only another kind of slavery." And so, while believing she is reclaiming her youth, she is in fact running from her fear, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of being unloved, the fear of living with her own silence. She begins to compare, to doubt, and her mind becomes a battlefield, one half clinging to the past, the other hoping that happiness still awaits ahead. That is the true tragedy of modern humanity. We fight against nature instead of flowing with it. And when one fights nature, one never wins. One only grows exhausted. Yet in that very exhaustion, if a woman has the courage to stop, she will hear a whisper, the voice of truth. That time is not the enemy. It is merely the mirror reflecting who you have become. This rebellion, in the end, is not a fall from grace, but a transformation of consciousness. For sometimes, one must rebel completely in order to finally learn acceptance. When the inner storm becomes an earthquake in the outer world, after all those days battling time, the woman believes she has found freedom. But that freedom turns out to be nothing more than a shimmering illusion in a desert of loneliness. The inner rebellion, prolonged, begins to gnaw not only at her soul, but also at everything around her. And that is when the crisis ceases to be her private struggle. It becomes an earthquake that shakes everyone close to her. Her crisis becomes an earthquake for everyone around her. The husband, once full of love, now looks at her like a stranger. He cannot yet understand why the gentle woman he knew has turned cold, quick-tempered, or silent, as though she is no longer there. The children do not understand either. They only sense that something is collapsing within the home that once felt warm and safe. The painful truth is that the woman does not break the marriage because her husband is cruel, but because she can no longer bear herself. Each time she looks into the mirror, she sees not only an aging face, but a withering soul. The betrayal, whether in action or in thought, is not an attempt to destroy, but a desperate effort to feel alive again. In the brief moments of being desired, of being noticed, she feels that she still exists. But afterward, reality returns, raw and merciless. Alan Watts once said, "Every attempt to escape fear only makes it cling tighter." And indeed, the more she runs from her fear of aging, the more she loses the only thing that could bring her peace, true love and inner stillness. In that journey, the family becomes the invisible victim. The husband feels betrayed, yet he is merely witnessing a soul losing itself. The children cannot understand why the mother who once comforted them has grown distant and restless. Love, once a home, now becomes a shattered mirror reflecting the ruin of the spirit. And when it all ends, she sits alone in a quiet room, face to face with herself, no one left to blame, nowhere left to run. She realizes that every rebellion against time leads to the same destination: loneliness. But Alan Watts would not call that a tragedy. He would say, in your loneliness, you begin to truly see yourself. Perhaps this very breaking, however painful, is the necessary purification ritual that allows a woman to return to her most primal truth, the pure presence of her being. After the earthquake and a woman's soul shakes everything around her, a larger picture begins to appear. This tragedy is not hers alone, but the result of an unbalanced, merciless social structure. For while the woman wrestles with the fear of being forgotten, the man, at the same age, enters what society calls the prime of his life. Men enter their 40s with confidence. Women enter theirs with fear. And this seemingly simple statement reveals one of the deepest paradoxes of the modern age. Society has granted men the privilege of aging with dignity. When their hair turns gray, they are called mature. When wrinkles appear, people say they show experience and strength. They are praised for being refined, seasoned, and more dependable than ever. For men, time seems only to make them better. But for women, time is seen as a sentence. The very same signs, wrinkles, silver hair, a weary gaze, become evidence of decay. At 40, while men are admired for their experience, women are branded as past their prime. This injustice wounds not only their appearance, but slowly erodes their sense of self from within. Alan Watts once said, "Society teaches you to play a role, then punishes you when you no longer fit the part." And woman is the clearest victim of that cruel play. When she is young, she is taught that her value lies in beauty. When that beauty fades, society offers her no new role. It merely takes away the light she once had. While men are allowed to evolve, women are forced to cling to the past. From that, an existential pain grows. Not because women are weak, but because they are trapped in a system that treats youth as currency and beauty as the only exchange of worth. To survive, they are compelled to feel desired one last time. Yet in that pursuit, they fail to realize they are chasing an illusion, a definition of happiness programmed by society itself. And as Alan Watts once said, you can't find peace by running away from yourself. The difference between men and women in midlife is not biological, but social. It lies in how they are taught to see themselves. One is encouraged to bloom with time, the other is taught to fear it. Thus, the tragedy of womanhood is not merely aging, but the mistaken belief that when admiration fades, life's meaning fades with it. When people no longer know whether they are running toward or running away. And then, as the night of midlife descends, we realize this tragedy is not only a woman's, it is the mirror of an entire generation. Society has taught men and women two different ways to face time. Men are allowed to mature, while women are forced to fight decay. In that gap, countless souls have lost their way. She wasn't running towards something better. She was running from her own fear. And this line closes the video, but opens a deeper truth. The woman we've followed through this journey is not a betrayer, not selfish. She is a human being desperately trying to escape an invisible fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of not being loved, fear that her worth has expired. And when that fear grows too great, she does the only thing her instincts know. She runs. Alan Watts once said, "When you stop running from fear, you will see it as only your own shadow. But modern society does not give women time to stop. Everything around them, advertising, media, social networks, whispers the same poisonous message. You are only valuable when someone else still wants you. And so they grow up, fall in love, marry, become mothers, but are never truly taught how to love themselves. When the crisis comes, husbands often see only the surface, the coldness, the change, the departure. But Alan Watts would say, it is not anyone's fault. It is the eternal conflict between the ego and time, a battle everyone fights silently, some by facing it, others by fleeing it. The final message to men is not blame, but an invitation to understanding. Because if he can recognize the first signs, the distant eyes, the unusual silence, the unnamed sadness, and choose to listen instead of judge, he might help her stop running. Yet more deeply, this is not just a story of marriage or gender. It is the tragedy of our era, where people are programmed to believe that happiness lies in being chosen again, not in being whole. We chase novelty, forgetting that true peace is not found in starting over, but in awakening to the present. And perhaps, as Alan Watts once said, when you stop trying to become someone, you begin to truly be yourself. And that is the freedom every soul, man or woman, is searching for amid the storm of time. In the end, perhaps all of us, men and women alike, are walking the same path, learning to let go of illusion and return to ourselves. Time is not the enemy, but a silent teacher showing us how to love, how to lose, and how to exist without needing to be seen. When you stop trying to become someone, you begin to truly be yourself. And in that moment, you no longer run from time, you become the flow of it.